All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Emerging Leaders in Affordable Housing webinar series here at the National Housing Conference. We're really excited to have all of you join us, those of you who are emerging leaders as members of the National Housing Conference, and those who are of emerging leader age and are interested in learning a bit more about what is what this program is here, and who are excited to tune into this discussion that we're going to have on racial justice today. I'm really excited to have my two friends, Latana and Olivia, here in the room. I'm also joined by Quinn, who is another employee here at the National Housing Conference, and our policy director, Tristan Bro. So before I do any more introductions for our presentation today, I am going to turn it over to Tristan to talk about emerging leaders and some National Housing Conference updates.
Thank you, Nathan. I won't make mention of the fact that you said you had two friends in the room. And
all friends and colleagues.
Just Quinn and I are just here. But thank you, and I do appreciate the discussion today in the panel, or the presentation. I did want to say that I hope that emerging leaders will expand more than we've had it before. It's good to have staff members who are emerging leaders, so it always works well to have folks who are engaged and want to expand that part of NHC, which we've learned that if you don't have young individuals who are involved in the conversation, we will not have an organization for 80 more years, and so it's important to engage. I did want to emphasize the importance of getting involved and staying involved with NHC. Particularly as it relates to our Black Home Ownership Working Group, our CRA Working Group, as well as our GSE Reform Working Group. There are a lot of policy wonks and the people who have been involved with this conversation for 60 and 70 years in those working groups, and so having a different perspective is very, very important to us, and so make sure that you're getting involved and getting engaged within our working groups as well. I wouldn't be a good NHC staffer if I didn't talk about solutions for affordable housing, which is coming up on December 3rd and 4th. We are going to have a great day on the 3rd with a lot of different policy discussions around the three things I just mentioned, as far as a working group, but also the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, as well as climate impact and homelessness. Add solutions. That evening we will have a reception where we have an open bar. I always like that part of the day, and have a speaker, which we are confirming now. And then on the 4th, we'll have our advocacy day where we're having Chairman Lacey Clay of the Housing Subcommittee of Financial Services, as well as Debbie Dingle out of Detroit, well, part of Detroit, which is the co-chair of the DPCC. So with all that, I'm looking forward to the conversation we're having today, and make sure that you're engaged and involved, not just on webinars, but actually in all parts of NHC, because it is an important voice within the work that we do. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation today, and I look forward to many more to come.
Sweet. Thanks, Tristan. And so just to put a fine point on the solutions, if you are an emerging leader, which hopefully everyone who's tuning in today is, make sure that when you register for solutions, you use the discount code ELAH special. That will give you a discounted price, and that as opposed to our $100-some it takes to register, it'll be, I believe, 70, if not 60. But I can definitely provide more information, but just know that you get a big discount, and that runs until this Friday. So make sure to use that while you can. All right, and so before we jump into the presentation, just a few notes. So a link to view the presentation and download the slides will be emailed to everyone who registered today. So you will get access to everything that we're talking about, as well as we'll make sure that you can have points of contact if you have follow-up questions after this. But on the point of questions, if you do have questions that come out throughout the presentation, we are going to reserve time at the end to have kind of a Q&A with everyone. We really want to have a conversation, and as much as we'd love to open up the line to, however many people are tuning in, Q&A box is the best way to do it. So please, if you have thoughts, questions, ideas, send them along, and we will get to those at the end, and we'll love to have a little discussion. And the last thing is that if you need any help, you can view this website online, but given that we are all emerging leader age, I feel like this is probably less relevant because we're all more capable with our technology. So with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to give just a brief background on the history of race and housing, and how it is all connected, and kind of how the groundwork was laid for community development. So quickly on race and housing. The kind of big talking point that we hear a lot about when we have conversations about housing, when we look at what people are saying at the national level, presidential candidates, is a conversation about redlining. So redlining is something. It was a practice that was institutionalized by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency that was created during the Great Depression era to save homeowners from foreclosure, and also developed long-term, fully amortizing fixed-rate mortgages. So this is really important for how the housing finance system is set up today. But as many of us know, redlining explicitly used race as the most influential factor when it came to scoring neighborhoods and determining whether a neighborhood was worthy of investment or not. Redlining diverted taxpayer dollars away from hazardous communities and into communities that were deemed worth of investment, even though taxpayers in these other communities were also, it's in the name, paying taxes, and also were deserving of this investment. But at the time, as a reflection of how okay it was to be so openly vocal about racism and the devaluation of our, Black and brown communities in this country, this was something that was instituted by law and by federal law. The Federal Housing Administration, which made homeownership and wealth attainment possible for millions, used the Homeowner Loan Corporation's redlining maps as a guide to underwriting and promoting residential segregation, and encouraged the use of restrictive covenants, which were, again, reflective of the outward acceptance of racism at the time. And so just to put some numbers to the ways in which redlining's legacy has gone on to impact how homeownership and wealth generation has looked across racial lines today. Between 1934, which was the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and 1962, the government backed $120 billion in mortgages, but fewer than 2% of the FHA mortgages went to people of color. Today, nearly 2/3 of neighborhoods deemed hazardous by historic redlining maps are inhabited by mostly minority residents, typically Black and Latino communities. 91% of areas classified as quote-unquote best in the 1930s remain middle to upper income today, and 85% of them are still predominantly white. In addition, there were other unintended consequences that still carry on to today. So we also know that historically redlined communities face higher rates of asthma, as a lot of these communities are closer to sources of pollution, so this also becomes an environmental justice problem. Also have less access to high quality schools and more. So that's kind of one of the big talking points that we hear a lot about, but as we're about to see with this fun little graphic, there are a lot of other ways in which wealth has been diverted from communities of color in this country, and has been done so since the inception of this country. So though, this is a country that was built on the backs of unpaid involuntary slave labor, low estimates of the economic benefits of slavery to white people begin at $1 trillion. And things have, it wasn't that slavery ended and things got better. There's still been many ways in which race has been legislated and done so at the detriment of communities of color in this country. So, there's the example of the General Sherman Civil War plan failing. The plan was to divide up plantations and give free slaves 40 acres and a mule as part of reparations for slavery, but that failed in the South, and instead the DC government officials actually ended up paying $300 per slave upon emancipation, not to the slaves, but to local slave holders as compensation for loss of property. Additionally, post-slave era, convict leasing and sharecropping essentially created the slave state once again. The head right system provided heads of households 50 acres of land or more for each person in the household, including indentured slaves and servants, meaning that slave owners benefited from having more benefited from more land with the more enslaved people that they had. This land was also primarily seized from indigenous tribes, and head rights, land grants, homestead grants allowed for the redistribution of tens of millions of acres of land from indigenous communities to white families. And this was also done so at the behest or at the protection of the U.S. militia at the time. But we also look at things like the Social Security Act, which today provides safety net for millions of workers, and at the time was a huge win for these workers. But when it was passed, the act specifically excluded two occupations, looking at agricultural workers and domestic servants, who were predominantly African American, Mexican, and Asian. 1935 Wagner Act also helped establish new rights for white people. It granted unions power of collective bargaining, which helped millions of white workers gain entry into the middle class. But it also permitted unions to exclude non-whites and deny them access to better paid jobs and union protection and benefits such as healthcare, job security, and pensions. Many craft unions remained nearly all white until the 1970s. If we look at urban renewal and we look at the build out of the U.S. highway system, which tore down communities of color that were living in concentrated poverty that were effectively designed by prior federal policies and redlining, these were both employed under the guise of helping these communities and essentially were state-sanctioned displacement of communities of color. And today, racial discrimination in housing and finance systems is still prevalent. So we can look at the financial crisis of the late 2000s, which disproportionately impacted Black and brown households, many of whom were targeted by predatory lenders and bundled into mortgages they couldn't afford. Meanwhile, banks and GSEs received billions of dollars in bailouts. And despite the role of major banks in the crisis, only one bank actually faced criminal charges, and this was a small, family-owned community bank in Chinatown, New York. And today, the financial crisis is disproportionately impacting communities of color, particularly as it affects folks' credit worthiness. And so on the topic of credit worthiness, also 30% of African American and Latinx consumers are credit invisible or unscorable. This is in part because they have had little access to traditional financial products and relegated to non-traditional lenders, setting off a downward spiral that makes them more likely to be credit invisible and have lower credit scores. We also know that technology-based solutions that we are kind of pointing to as non-biased ways in which we can solve these issues, like credit scoring and automated underwriting systems, actually further racial bias instead of easing it, because credit scores and automated underwriting systems rely on algorithms that are actually weaponized against communities of color, in part because of this bias towards credit worthiness and looking at the history of access to credit as it affects communities of color. So researchers actually estimate that borrowers of color are being overcharged by between 250 million to 500 million annually in the fintech space alone. So here's a little bit of more context. Tristan earlier mentioned that we have a Black homeownership working group, and this graph looks at why that work is so important to us. So these are different rates of homeownership by race and ethnicity. We see that the white homeownership rate is nearly at 75%. It's way up there, way above the U.S. total. We have both Hispanic and the Hispanic Latino homeownership rates and then African American homeownership rates well below 50%. And then if we actually look at the change in homeownership, the reason why we are looking at the Black homeownership rate in particular is because, in the wake of the crash, homeownership dipped for all groups. But as we've been recovering, the white homeownership rate has been recovering. The Latinx homeownership rate has also been recovering and is returning to nearly pre-financial crisis rates. But the Black homeownership rate is actually continuing to decline. And so there's a lot of things to unpack there, which is why, we're looking into this issue in particular and putting so many resources towards it here at NHC. And so just a few other points to make about the ways in which, our nation has systematically disadvantaged communities of color in this country. So if we look at 1865, which is just after the emancipation, the Black wealth in this country accounted for 0.5% of the U.S.'s total wealth. And over 100 years later, in 1990, Black wealth accounted for only 1% of the of U.S. total wealth. Additionally, if we look at the ways in which we incentivize homeownership rates and put more money towards homeownership, whereas we are still neglecting folks who really need assistance with rental, The mortgage interest deduction in 2015 cost the federal government $71 billion, whereas Section 8 funding in that same year was only at $30 billion. So this is essentially where the government is spending $1,500 per household for high-income households, but then only $400 per household for low-income households. So we also have some other points here. 11% of low-income households receive housing assistance, which is to say that there is a huge gap in the housing assistance that we are providing them. And Black neighborhoods are devalued by $156 billion due to race. So not all is lost. This is a very short list, but of some really impactful ways in which we have been responding at the federal level, and also by proxy at the state and local levels. So we have the Fair Housing Act, the Community Reinvestment Act, the development of the CDC and CDFI industries, and more. And so that last point on the CDFI industry is important because we have two wonderful representatives from the CDFI industry who are here to talk a bit about their work. So just as a quick primer, the CDFI industry began forming in the 1960s. In the 1990s, the industry expanded drastically as the CDFI Fund, a federal government agency that certifies and provides funding to CDFIs, was established. So I'm going to, with that kind of whirlwind of information and a bit of a primer, turn it over to Olivia first, who will help lead us into a more uplifting and hopeful conversation around, the work that's being done in these spaces and the questions that's being asked.
Thanks, Nathan, and thanks very much to NHC for having me on the webinar today. I'm excited to share some of the work we've been doing on racial equity. And I was actually just reflecting, I think it's only fitting that NHC's first webinar for the Emerging Leaders Group should focus on racial equity, given how very encompassing this topic is in our lives, and especially in the context of the work that we do. So I'm happy to be here today for this important conversation, and thanks to you guys for convening the conversation. So like Nathan said, I'm Olivia Barrow. I am the policy officer at the Low Income Investment Fund. I started working at LIF in April of this year, and before that, I was a senior policy analyst at Enterprise Community Partners, doing similar advocacy work around federal programs for affordable housing and community development. So I figured I'd start with a bit of background about LIF and then go into the work that we've been doing around racial equity. So LIF is a community development financial institution, or CDFI, like Nathan just mentioned. And our mission is to invest in low-income people and places to improve life trajectories and outcomes. So for those listeners who aren't familiar with CDFIs, we are organizations, and in LIF's case, we are a nonprofit organization that assembles the various sources of capital that are necessary to invest in a range of things that people and places need to be successful. So things like affordable housing and high-quality childcare and affordable grocery stores and other types of real estate that benefit low-income people. And the capital sources that we assemble come from a number of different places. So some of it's government funding, some of it's philanthropy, some of it's banks and other sources. So CDFIs as a whole serve an important function in the financial services industry because we provide the financial products and services that low-income people and places have unfortunately been historically denied, be it through discriminatory lending practices, a lot of which Nathan mentioned, the practices that cut off certain people and places from accessing capital. And then a lot of the projects that we finance are simply not seen as economically viable by traditional financial institutions like banks. So these banks might see some of these activities as too small or too risky or too complicated. But that's where CDFIs like LIF come into play. We offer the time and the expertise and the flexible sources of financing and the patience that ultimately make these projects with very high impact possible. So we have been tremendously successful. As you can see on the slide, over the last 35 years, LIF has invested $2.5 billion in communities across the country. And our investments have served over 2 million people and generated over $65 billion in benefits to families and communities. And as I suggested, we've achieved this impact by investing in a range of community assets. So the 5 core areas we focus on are housing, childcare, education, health, and transit-oriented development. And then, of course, running throughout the entirety of LIFT's work is the policy advocacy work that I'm focused on. And that effort is really seeking to preserve the programs that we already have that have proven to be very successful in the community development industry. So that's things like the New Markets Tax Credit, Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, CDFI fund appropriations, things like that. And then our policy work is also focused on developing and implementing new ideas, innovative ideas to support the CDFI industry's mission. And so I think we've done tremendous work over the past few decades, as have our partners, but we have not solved poverty. I think we can all, unfortunately, step outside and see quite clearly that the economic inequality and other barriers to opportunity that we've all been working to dismantle, that's all still way too prevalent. And in some ways, since the CDFI industry sort of got started doing this work, the problem's only gotten worse. And that's despite the significant time and resources that have gone into countless projects with very clear and very tangible benefits for people and places. So that leads us to a difficult question as a field and as an organization. Why hasn't our work been having the kind of impacts on people and communities that we hope it has? And a large portion of that answer, I certainly don't think it's the entirety of the answer, but a significant part no less, is that the industry as a whole has not been fully grappling with the role that race plays in our work. So for instance, we assume we're adding to racial equity as CDFIs throughout the course of our work, our normal business, because we are investing in projects that support historically disinvested people and places. But notice on the slide that there's no line about racial equity running throughout the impact pathways. So if we're not naming it, how effective can we be? So recognizing this shortcoming in our own work, LIFT committed internally to a social justice and equity initiative with a specific first emphasis on racial equity. We are looking at our own internal practices and how they impact organizational equity. So that includes focusing on things like hiring and retention and building out infrastructure to support social justice and equity, because it does require a commitment and significant resources. And then in partnership with Race Forward, which is a group focused on building movements for racial justice, LIFT also began a pilot racial equity initiative earlier this year, made up of a core team of 12 LIFT staff, and that includes me. I'm one of the lucky staff on the core team. And we all come from different offices and different teams and different backgrounds within the organization. So our core team chose to pilot 3 initial questions in the first phase of our work, and those are how we measure racial equity, which is the subgroup that I've been leading, how we incorporate racial equity into our contracting processes, including the vendors, the consultants, and others that we partner with, and then the big question on everyone's mind, how do we deploy capital in a racially equitable way? So the ultimate outcome of this work is supposed to result in an equity action plan, and that's intended to be closely connected to our broader, 5-year strategic planning process, which is also underway. So I should note here that racial equity is not the only type of equity that we're focused on, but when you look at the data across any type of marginalized group, so be it gender or sexual orientation or ability status or any other group, racial minorities and specifically African American populations experience higher rates of disadvantage even within those groups. So we are taking the position that we cannot address any of these issues without first tackling race. And I also want to use this space to highlight a great resource from LIFT's former president and CEO, Nancy Andrews, who wrote for the Urban Institute last month about the importance of explicitly embedding a race, gender, and social justice lens into our community development work, and specifically into our place-based work. So the link is on the slide, and I highly encourage folks to give it a look. I think it's a great paper and offers important food for thought for all of us. So I wanted to spend the rest of my time touching on some of the takeaways I've found from our internal racial equity process. It's the initiative that we've undertaken is intended to be an iterative process and not expected to end at any point, but hopefully it will start to take shape in the coming months and turn into something with some more concrete deliverables. We are still working in our subgroups to grapple with the 3 pilot areas we identified, so I want to be clear that I don't have any answers or solutions to share today, but I think that's okay because this work is difficult and tricky and really has no end in sight. So I think sharing some of the takeaways I've found over the last few months is important to inform the work of other organizations that may be starting out on the journey of infusing racial equity into their own work. So my first takeaway is that we have way more questions than we have answers. In my subgroup that's focusing on measuring racial equity, we often find ourselves answering a question with another question. A good example that comes up often is the location in which affordable housing is located and how the concept of ideal locations has changed over time. So over the last few decades, affordable housing has largely been located and built in low-income communities because these have been the areas in which the greatest need is concentrated. So we've obviously concentrated scarce resources in these communities. But the unintended consequences of this approach have become increasingly clear in recent years. Building affordable housing only in low-income areas implicitly concentrates poverty and therefore segregation as well. So the industry has recently shifted to focus on building more affordable housing in areas of opportunity, which I think is very important, and there is a lot of work to be done at the federal, state, and local levels to remove a lot of the barriers to building housing in these areas that are connected to good jobs and transit and educational opportunities. So we have a lot of work to do there, and it's vitally important work. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that shifting fully in this direction can be prescriptive if we tell people that they have to live in these quote-unquote desirable areas in order to be successful. So we need to be able to take all of these factors into account at once and understand that answering the question about how to do this work in a racially equitable way is going to lead to many more questions, and it's going to be a process with many questions and ongoing acknowledgments of where we've come from and where we are trying to go. And then my second takeaway is that data can be particularly tricky here. In a lot of instances, we found that data simply isn't available to allow us to disaggregate impacts by race. And some of that is stuff we can address, and it simply requires us to be better about collecting and tracking data, which is something we're working on internally at LIFT. But in some cases, we may never be able to fully track data on race. So for instance, take the housing industry, for example. Fair housing laws prevent us from asking questions about tenants' race, which means we almost exclusively have to use data on tenants' income and extrapolate that to broader community level data about the demographics of the neighborhood if we want to try and figure out the racial demographics of people living in particular areas. So these are just some of the challenges with data that we're still wrapping our heads around, at least internally at LIFT, just in terms of what can we collect and how can we collect it, and what are the limitations of data. And then I have listed here a obvious but nevertheless important takeaway that every community is different. So what we measure in one community may have entirely different causes and meanings than the same measurement in a different community. It's difficult, to say the least, to account for all of the barriers and variables that may influence racial equity in a particular area. So we have been very focused on the importance of including a local perspective in any evaluation effort, because we need to account for the factors that we simply wouldn't otherwise be able to account for, and that includes talking to people in the community. But what counts as a local perspective and how it is incorporated remain ongoing questions that certainly vary by community and vary based off of what stakeholders are in the room and how we are going about our evaluation process. fourth and related is how difficult it is to change systems. So the system we have right now is generating the exact outcomes it is intended to generate. And, you know, those outcomes are obviously not equitable outcomes, but they are occurring because it's the system is designed to create those outcomes. The issue is systemic, and it needs to be addressed at such a level, but this is very difficult because it means changing thoughts and feelings and educational institutions and environments and relationships and all of the other ingrained patterns that we all know as quote unquote normal. So we have to continuously acknowledge that we are working to change a system from within the system that a lot of people benefit from, and that includes many of us in the community development industry. And then finally, it's a bit simplistic, but I wanted to end on the note that however difficult this work might be, it is critical that we continue to take it on. Given the history of place-based discrimination in our country and the well-documented disadvantages that have ensued over the following decades and centuries, we cannot expect to be successful on our collective community development journey if we do not directly address racial equity in our work. So I'm very pleased to be at an organization focused on this issue so intensely, and I'm very pleased to have partners like NHC to convene these conversations and partners like LISC who are fighting the fight with us.
Thank you, Olivia. That was wonderful and very thought-provoking. Got a lot of questions. I'm going to turn it over to Matana now. This will give a quick transition period. Great.
Cool. So thanks, Nathan and NHC, for, again, convening this webinar and just having us here for this conversation. I think it's really important. And thank you, Olivia. I think you set a really good foundation for what I'm about to talk about, which is kind of how I incorporate these principles of racial equity into my work and what that can look like on the ground, specifically here in DC. So a little bit about me before I get into LISC. I am an assistant program officer at LISC DC, and I've been there since 2016. And so in my role currently, I manage our grants. We have a fellowship program, and then I support our other community development initiatives throughout the city. And so I think I can kind of just breeze through these next few slides. LISC is also a CDFI like LISC. So it's the same process. We pool resources and work with our partners to support communities. And so we're all over the country, and I work in our DC office specifically. And so since we were started in 1979, we've invested $20 billion nationwide, thus leveraging $60 billion, which is a lot. And so part of our impact of that is we've built or preserved 400,000 homes and created 67 million square feet of commercial space, retail space, and community space. And you can kind of just read examples of that on the slide. And so before we get started, or before I kind of dig into what we are doing here in DC, I want to start with a couple of key definitions that really drive my work. And so the first one is a definition of racial equity that I really like, and it's from Equity in the Center. And so they define racial equity as the condition where one's racial identity has no influence on how one fares in society. Racial equity is one part of racial justice and must be addressed at the root causes and not just the manifestation. So this includes the elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race. And I just want to highlight the part where it says that these issues must be addressed at the root causes and not just at the manifestations. I think it's pretty easy to put Band-Aid solutions on things and be like, look, we fixed it. But like Olivia said, these changes have to happen in the system, and it's not always going to be easy. It's going to require a lot of attitude change and education and other things, but it's incredibly necessary. And so the next definition that I have is a definition of equitable development from PolicyLink. And so they define equitable development as a positive development strategy that ensures that everyone participates in and benefits from the region's economic transformation, especially low-income residents, communities of color, immigrants, and others at risk of being left behind. It requires an intentional focus on eliminating racial inequities and barriers and making accountable and catalytic investments to assure that lower wealth residents, one, live in healthy, safe, and opportunity-rich neighborhoods that reflect their culture and that they are not displaced from these neighborhoods. Two, connect to economic and ownership opportunities. And three, have voice and influence in the decisions that shape their neighborhoods. So to give you guys a little bit of context about what DC looks like, there's a lot more stats that you can look up online, but I just want to say that DC is 59% non-white and 41% Black. And so 17% of DC's population is living in poverty, and of that 17%, a majority is Black and Hispanic. If you go to the next slide, it shows that, yes, DC has these really large communities of color, but they are not experiencing economic success in the way that their white counterparts are. As you can see on this chart, over the past 10 years, median income has stagnated for Black families or households, whereas it has grown significantly for non-Hispanic white households. That's a problem. Two ways. So I'm going to then talk about two ways that LIST DC has incorporated these principles of racial equity and equitable development into our work. And so this is through our grant making and our place-based initiatives. So I'll be talking about elevating equity first. And so elevating equity is a $50 million LIST DC initiative targeted to the neighborhoods surrounding the site of the future 11th Street Bridge Park. And so this initiative is grounded in that definition of equitable development that I read earlier. And so elevating equity in concert with our nonprofit partners who are part of this initiative represents a shared vision for a more healthy and sustainable neighborhood and city. So our goal is to help create a Washington, D.C. that fosters equity and provides economic, educational, and political opportunities for all residents living both in this impact area as well as throughout the city, regardless of income, race, or immigration status. And so in conceiving of this initiative, so the goal is to invest in and facilitate projects and activities that are equitable and inclusive in nature, thus providing opportunities and resources for lower income households, where in DC that often or typically intersects with households that are of color and other historically marginalized groups who may be long-term residents of this area or newcomers, to allow them to thrive in this area, especially as the Bridge Park gets built, that the park can be, and we are seeing that it is a draw for investment in these neighborhoods, particularly east of the Anacostia River. And so we want to ensure that the people that have been living in these neighborhoods for a while, as well as the potential newcomers, are all able to equitably enjoy the resources that are coming to that area. And so LIST has actually been investing in this neighborhood since before the Bridge Park was an idea. And we got involved with this project through working with Scott Kratz, who is the Bridge Park director. And over time, we've provided them with financial support, as well as extensive program management and technical assistance to help kind of get this on the ground, especially with regards to their equitable development plan. So part of elevating equity actually is implementing the recommendations that were identified in this equitable development plan, which were then identified by community residents and leaders. And so if you look at the graphic here, this is just addressing different forms of displacement pressures that guides are investing in this specific geographic zone. So to date, we have invested almost $45 million of the $50 million, thus creating or preserving 585 affordable homes, creating 6 high-quality community facilities, and supporting 20 different nonprofit organizations. And so looking at this map, might be a little hard to see, but right in the middle of the river there is that red box. That's where the 11th Street Bridge Park is going to go. And then the light area is the impact area. And so next, I want to talk about our grant-making strategy, because I think that as an organization that does provide various types of resources and funding to other organizations, we have a lot of say in what types of work we want to support. And so in 2018, we actually updated our capacity building grant-making strategy to intentionally target resources to organizations who are working to prevent displacement of low-income communities and communities of color, and also to support orgs that are creating opportunities for equity and inclusion in DC neighborhoods. And so this specific type of funding that we use comes from an allocation from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so these funds, they're called Section 4 funds, are designed to build the capacity of community development organizations to carry out affordable housing activities as well as community development activities that benefit low and moderate income families and individuals, which again intersect with race here in DC especially. And so priority was given to nonprofits who, so we put out an RFP, and priority was given to nonprofits who are undertaking the following activities. So affordable housing preservation and development, inclusive economic development, health equity, and cultural and civic vitality. And so we wanted our grant funding to really support orgs in strengthening or expanding their programs, building new partnerships, or strengthening organizational infrastructure, helping to ensure that the local priorities identified by community members were met. And so in evaluating and selecting the grantees for this round of funding, it involved creating and using this really intense rubric to assess how closely each proposal adhered to the selection criteria. So the alignment with LISC's vision and goals as outlined in that RFP, organizational capacity, and the capacity for these orgs to deliver high quality programs and projects. And then finally, or not, last but definitely not least, the fidelity to equity and inclusion. So we wanted to make sure that the orgs that we supported were not just advancing racial equity externally, but that internally staff looked like the communities, staff and boards looked like the communities that they have set out to help, and that they are really intentional about elevating the voices of the communities that they serve. And so we're wrapping up the grants. And so early next year, we'll be taking a look at the impacts and to see how well these grant activities met both LISC stated goals, the org goals, as well as how they advance racial equity. And so one example that I want to close with is an organization that we've supported called ELAH, and they are an organization with a mission of providing single-family home repairs throughout DC and Prince George's County, which is right outside of DC. And so we provided them with a grant to support this work specifically east of the Anacostia River, which has some of both the highest population of Black folks in DC as well as some of the lowest incomes and just general social outcomes. And so we provided them with this funding to evaluate and remediate health-related triggers in homes that are causing respiratory problems. So for some background, in DC, approximately 60% of housing was built before 1950, and more than 80% was built before 1978. And so this older housing is actually prevalent in lower income communities and is expensive to maintain due to older plumbing, electrical, roofing systems, HVAC systems, things like that. And so these homes present elevated risks for childhood lead poisoning and exposure to cockroaches, rodents, dust, and mold that contribute to persistent asthma. And so ELAH's repair work addresses these issues by providing healthier and safer places to live. And one reason why this work is really important is that repairing aging housing stock does not cost as much as building new affordable housing, and is actually really critical to preserving existing housing for families that don't have the resources to move into newer homes or just want to remain where they're living. So that's it for me.
Sweet, thank you, Latana. That was wonderful. Let me throw up all of our contact information before we hop into this Q&A section, which is Where is it? Okay, well, give me a moment. Well, so while I'm trying to figure out, oh, it's there. I would just like to kind of like open us up to these questions, kind of with some of, some things that I'm hearing, and then a question to both of you. So, in both of your presentations, there are kind of, Olivia, you touched on how communities are all different. And Latanya, you were talking about like the ways in which you are kind of, and your organization is looking to make sure that, the staff is like representative of the place that they're in, and that actually people are like really focused on, sorry, let me get this slide up. Inclusion in that way, and it makes me think of a question that I ponder every once in a while here at NHC. I think in the room we have kind of 3 different levels of engagement with communities. So at NHC, we're a convener. We convene other housing organizations. A lot of them are also national organizations focused on more narrow policy, priorities. And so we are, I would argue, the furthest away from actual, involvement in community here. The policies that we, the suite of policies that we advocate for at NHC in the long term, are going to be impacting the communities in the way that people build wealth and live lives. But we don't, just by nature of the work that we're doing as a convener, we are a bit further away. And LIFT is a little bit closer to the ground, and is actually investing in places as well as working on policy. And then LIFT, and especially LIFT DC as a local chapter, is much closer to the ground. And so it for me, a question that I wonder is, we are all in this work as housers and in the community development field because we want to make positive impacts on the lives of people around us and on the lives of our neighbors who are don't have the resources. And something that I just think about every once in a while is how do we make sure that we really are being representative? How do we make sure that we're actually hearing, balancing between a conversation of the systemic issues that need to be addressed at this very high level, with everyday needs and the immediate needs of the people who are living in these communities that we want to support and say that we're supporting. And so I guess as I'm the furthest away, so I'm going to step back from this question. But as the two of you are a bit closer, if you could just kind of talk a little bit more about, what does it actually mean to be in those communities and to really be fielding, what are their needs? And I guess how do you kind of mix that also with what you've both clearly laid out is a, systemic approach to your work?
Yeah, so I think that it's kind of a two-pronged approach. Like you said, we're working really closely and intimately with communities here in DC specifically. And so, if there is an apartment building that's going up for sale, we will step in to help finance that purchase. That's like a very immediate need, just making sure that these residents are able to stay in their homes that they love and hopefully provide some often critical repairs that are often needed when these buildings go up for sale. So I think that, at least for me, using those two definitions that I mentioned earlier in my presentation, as well as just other resources in this subject, looking at my work on a day-to-day basis from what am I doing to help communities directly in DC right now, while also stepping back and and at the same time being okay, yes, there are these communities that need help or that, have needs that they've identified. Here's the ways in which LIFT can help, while also advocating on a larger scale for the changes that are needed for me to hopefully no longer have a job anymore. I think the goal is for all of us to not have jobs anymore because poverty and home ownership issues will be solved. But yeah, I think that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we'll be able to be employed in this industry for a long time. But that's what we're here for as the emerging leader, as young folks.
Yeah, I think Latanya just hit on it exactly. It has to be multifaceted work. We can certainly strive for longer-term systemic improvements so that we are in a situation where our jobs are no longer necessary. But at the same time, we have people who can't pay rent and who are a paycheck away from, you know, being homeless, and that's not okay. So we have to keep doing the work that we're doing now to alleviate these barriers to opportunity and these disadvantages, and as much as we can add a lens of equity into the work that we're doing now is critical, while also advocating for longer term systemic change.
Yeah.
We have our plates full.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm going to start, for folks who have more questions that are coming up, and there's a number in here that we're going to get to, please feel free to ask them. Just to kind of pick up on one of the threads that we were just talking about as well. Someone mentioned, you know, they noticed that the Latinx ownership rate is recovering, but also seems to be tipping down in the last couple of years, and is asking about whether it's a function of immigration and other policies. That's something that I personally can't speak to. I'm not quite sure about the details on that, but I will note that you know, when we are talking about how communities are different and that each place and each demographic has their own particular needs, when we look at like immigrant communities right now, we see that they're under attack. You know, HUD has earlier this year put out a proposal that they so far seem to be going forward with to, you know, take back funding, you know, public housing support for households that have undocumented members of family living in them. So currently, households that have, you know, let's say there's a household of 4 and one of the family members is undocumented and the rest of the folks are legal citizens or legal to be in the U.S., they already are receiving a prorated housing subsidy, so they'll be getting 75% of the 100% subsidy they are qualified for. And HUD right now is working out the details of a rule that says, well, if there's anyone who's undocumented in this household, you know, we're going to remove all funding. And this is a huge threat because it actually is threatening the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, including 55,000 legal children citizens of the United States. And so, you know, this is one way in which this community is also being particularly affected. And so when we think about solutions that, you know, we want to push forward with, you know, it's also important to make sure that we are being very attentive to the different ways in which we are trying to address these causes. And you've also seen, I mean, to the flip side of that, because there's the issues of disparate impact that's being rolled back that are all very scary. You've also seen this great push at the local level. I'm still thinking in the context of immigrant communities to create extra protections for not only immigrants living in these communities and in homes, but also for undocumented folks. So New York City has has allowed undocumented folks to now enter into their affordable housing lottery, which is really great news. Now they can have access to, you know, affordable homes that are really hard to come across in a place like New York City. But there's, of course, some more work to be done. But that's, you know, another thread that, you know, I think important noting. So I have a question in particular for Liz. Someone is asking, what are the next steps that Liz plans to take based on the work so far?
That's a great question, and a lot of it is still being fleshed out. So, like I mentioned, we have this core team, this initial pilot process, and part of what we've been trying to do through the 3 subgroup streams of work is pilot internally what it would look like to infuse racial equity into different parts of our organization. And we are still going through the process, right? So I don't know what the end product is going to look like. And I think we, at this stage in the process, are increasingly aware that there's not necessarily going to be an end product or a tangible, you know, this is what we do neatly tied up in a bow, because this is a very sticky issue and it's going to require ongoing effort. So I think at this point we're planning to be committed to social justice and equity, and specifically racial equity for the long term. And ideally, we will continue to evaluate more parts of our work, both internally and in the work we do with communities and partners, to make sure that we're doing it in the most equitable way possible. But in terms of specific sort of deliverables, it's still to be determined.
Great. So as an aside, someone's asking, Latana, I don't know if you have these off the top of your head, but also when you're talking about the breakdown of demographics in DC with the AAPI community here. As a proud member of the AAPI community in DC, I can tell you I don't know any of the statistics around our communities. I don't know if you have that off the top of your head or if this person wants to reach out after.
Yeah.
Follow up.
Off the top of my head, I do not have the information, unfortunately, but feel free to send me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to talk further.
Yeah. Cool. And so we'll do one more question before like a last little wrap-up question. And this one is a bit of a, I wouldn't say a curveball per se, but as folks who all are living in a city, maybe we won't be as well versed to answer the question, but we can give it our best shot. But someone's asking, do you have recommendations for how to approach racial justice and equity development in rural or conservative areas? And that's a question I'm really happy to keep thinking through and to have a conversation. So the person who asked that, like, please send an email. I love to have something to think on. And I mean, I think it is, when we do also talk about housing and community development, I will say that there is a bias towards looking at cities. And we know that our rural communities are really being left behind in a lot of different ways. If we think about the Community Reinvestment Act, one of the biggest challenges that we're thinking about is, what happens for unbanked areas, places that don't actually have physical banks present, and how does that affect their access to, investment and money that can help revitalize those communities when they're really struggling. And rural communities, to the point on differences that each community has, they have their own particular issues too that we also need to be very attentive to, and that have different needs to think through.
Yeah, so piggybacking off of that, LISC actually has a really robust rural program that focuses on rural America, including Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So again, if you want to connect with me offline, I'm happy to connect you with some more information about that and maybe some people in that department, because they do really awesome work. But my focus is on DC, so that's really what I can speak to the best.
Great. For someone who was asking about Black homeownership millennial rates, please send me an email. I'm happy to send you some studies about that. But just to close off the webinar, given that, again, this is a group of emerging leaders and we're working in an industry that is admittedly very white and generally much older age-wise, it's really exciting to have a room full of folks who are, we're all around the same age, and are really interested in the work that's happening in these spaces, and to have people online who are also tuning in and in this space. So I guess if people just want to briefly say something about like what excites them about the work that they do, that would be, I feel like, a fun way to close.
Oh, absolutely. Everything excites me about my work. These are big issues we are grappling with, right? Like, even putting aside the racial equity piece, everything that I grapple with in my work makes me feel like I am adding to society and adding to a particular industry that's trying to do really important work. And so when you do add in the specific focus on racial equity, I think it just goes to show how passionate this industry is and how willing the industry as a whole is to say, we have these goals in mind and we have not hit these goals. What have we been doing that's making it difficult to achieve our mission? And being in that space, to me, is very rewarding, and I couldn't ask to be in an industry that's more thoughtful and thoughtful.
I think for me, like you said, a lot of things excite me about this work, but I think what is most exciting and I think impactful for me is actually talking to the communities and to the people that I'm hoping to serve through my work. I think it's pretty easy to sit around in a room and talk about like these big picture ideas on like how to achieve racial equity and just equity in general. But whenever I can talk with tenants in a building that, they've purchased their building, they're going through the process of renovating it, organizations that serve, children in lower income neighborhoods in DC, I think that's what's most exciting to me.
Yeah. And I think for me, so I would argue that there are two things that underpin every problem that we're trying to address in this country, and that's housing and then climate change. My opinion. but I'll argue that to my grave. And I think that what in particular excites me about like the young movement or the emerging movement, emerging leaders movement within the industry, not just in NHC, but across the industry, is that we, I think, have been taught to think more broadly about what does like actual systems change mean, and it's not even just looking within housing, but then looking across issues like housing and health, housing and environment, all of the different ways that multiple problems intersect and how housing underpins all of those. And so I think what's really exciting is in the context of this conversation and the Emerging Leadership Program, continuing to meet more people who also have all of these really wonderful ideas about how, and these aspirations to really connect all of these really sideload parts of our government, of the ways in which we pursue work, and say, how can we bring these together and make solutions that are going to be, you know, hit at root causes and actually, you know, solutions like for the 21st century, when so many things we can't ignore at the same time. So I'm excited, in short, for, to get to know everyone. I'm excited to have all of you here, and we're really grateful that you all joined us for this first ELAH webinar. There's going to be more. If people have suggestions about topics that they want to learn about, we want to make sure that this program is something that provides you with educational as well as networking opportunities that you want to have. So there's going to be much more plans coming out. We're looking to plan some sort of networking opportunity at the beginning of the calendar year. As Tristan mentioned at the beginning, make sure that you come to Solutions, which is not only going to be an awesome educational opportunity, but also a great place to meet a bunch of industry leaders and experts. So please make sure that you sign up for that and stay tuned. If you're not an ELAH member, go to NHC's website. You can register. It's going to be a great deal, and we're going to be really excited to have you. So thanks, everyone, for joining, and hope that you come back next time. Have a good one.